With the US entering a recession and inflation reaching multi-decade highs, there's no doubt that the Western world has been on edge for quite some time. Many have been struggling to make ends meet, whether that be paying for gas or keeping up with the skyrocketing rent. Even those that make a moderate salary have been worried as they've seen their monthly savings go down substantially. But all of this is quite insignificant to the economic situation in Lebanon. You see, Lebanon has not only been facing an economic cooldown, but a full-on economic crisis. Their GDP growth rate has been negative for years now, and things have gotten especially bad over the past 2 years. This has caused their GDP to tumble from nearly $55 billion to a low of $18 billion. To make things worse, Lebanon is not just fighting a shrinking economy, but also hyperinflation. If you thought America's 9% inflation was terrible, just look at this. When the pandemic started, Lebanon's inflation rate roared to 150%. For a little bit, it seemed like things were cooling down, but then they saw another surge that took inflation all the way to over 200%. Despite this horrendous situation, the Western world at large hasn't really paid much attention. The story of Lebanon has been buried by fears surrounding the US stock market, the Fed, inflation, the supply shortage, home prices, Ukraine, and so on. Now, I don't blame the West for ignoring Lebanon given how many internal issues they've been dealing with themselves. But in the sake of telling Lebanon's story, here's how Lebanon collapsed right beneath our feet without anyone even noticing. Taking a look back, it might seem like Lebanon's economic issues started alongside the pandemic, but that was just the beginning of the collapse. Lebanon's economic turmoil can actually be traced all the way back to 1975. This was the year that a group of phalangists decided to attack a bus filled with Palestinian refugees traveling to Lebanon. With the tensions already running hot between these two groups, it didn't take long for this attack to escalate into a conflict and eventually a full-on civil war. To make things worse, this wasn't just a 2 or 5 year war, it ended up lasting 15 years. I don't think you'd be surprised here that Lebanon was devastated economically by the time the war came to an end. But fortunately, the rest of the world came to their aid. Lebanon received tons of foreign aid along with massive gifts from neighboring countries, which allowed them to build up significant central bank reserves. Meanwhile, millions of Lebanese had found work abroad throughout the Civil War, and many of them sent back substantial amounts to their families. While these were all extremely kind gestures, looking back, it might have done more harm than good because it prevented Lebanon's economy from truly developing. Lebanon became dependent on foreign aid, while its citizens became dependent on family members living abroad. Lebanon further leaned into this dependency by pegging their currency with the US dollar. The central bank promised that they would always exchange 1,507 Lebanese Liras for $1. This wasn't a very difficult promise to fulfill in the beginning, given that Lebanon had plenty of foreign currencies rolling in. But over time, this dried up. You see, citizens with family members living abroad either passed away or moved abroad themselves. It also didn't help that virtually everyone who had the opportunity to leave the country did exactly that. Between 1975 and 1990, nearly 1 million people left the country, and between 1990 and 2019, another 750,000 people left. Aside from declining demographics, Western countries also started pulling back substantially on their aid. You see, when the West started supporting Lebanon in the early 1990s, the Middle East wasn't really seen as an enemy. Of course, there was the Persian Gulf War, but the main enemy in most Westerners' minds was the Russian commies. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, however, the communist threat slowly subsided and we saw Middle Eastern fears grow. And this of course climaxed with 9/11. With Middle Eastern tension reaching all-time highs, it's not surprising that Western politicians did not want to continue providing aid to countries like Lebanon. It simply wasn't a good look for their administration. To make things worse, a terrorist group in Lebanon named Hezbollah was starting to gain some traction, and this basically cut off all foreign aid. Banks struggled to maintain the conversion rate between liras and dollars, and it wasn't long until they resorted to fraudulent practices. To maintain a pegged conversion rate, you need a strong supply of both currencies. Lebanese banks had plenty of liras but virtually no dollars. Now, they could have made the liras a free-floating currency, meaning that its value would fluctuate based on supply and demand. But given the weak fundamentals of Lebanon, the central bank knew that liras would get destroyed by the free markets. So they decided to keep the peg and pop up the lira for as long as possible. To accomplish this, they needed more dollars, and what better way to attract dollars than to pump up interest rates? Lebanon would pump up interest rates to 15% and eventually even 20% for individuals who deposited dollars. But as you would guess, such rates were impossible to achieve through legitimate means. More times than not, Lebanon was simply borrowing money to pay these high interest rates and keep the country running, which led to the national debt getting out of hand. Between 2012 and 2019, Lebanon's debt to GDP ratio would rocket from 131%, which is already high, to 175%. For perspective, only 4 countries in the world have a higher debt to GDP ratio, and 3 of these countries have already collapsed economically. So it was just a matter of time until Lebanon followed in their footsteps. But nonetheless, the Lebanese government refused to give in. With such a high debt to GDP ratio, it became extremely difficult to take out more national debt. So Lebanon resorted to running a Ponzi scheme. They decided to pay their high interest rates with money from new depositors, and this more or less sealed their fate. As people started to realize what was happening, many of them attempted to withdraw their deposits. Lebanon obviously could not sustain these withdrawals. So, with no choice left in late 2019, they decided to essentially halt the withdrawals. Foreign currency withdrawals were limited to just $200 to $300 per week, and this would quickly turn into $0 per week as soon as the pandemic started. Technically, the government has yet to give up the peg with the US dollar, so according to Google, the conversion rate is still the same. But the real conversion rate is nowhere near this. At this point, you have to use the black markets to make the conversion, and the black market rate currently stands at 30,000 liras per dollar. This means that the purchasing power of the lira has basically collapsed 20x over the past 3 years. To make things worse, corrupt government officials are trying to run away with the remaining bank reserves. Take the central bank governor Riyad Salameh for example. He has allegedly transferred out $400 million to foreign accounts for himself and his relatives, and that's just one government official. Before the crisis started, Lebanon's foreign currency deposits stood at $176 billion. But by July of 2020, this number decreased to $114 billion. Given that legitimate withdrawals were essentially suspended during this time period, no one knows where exactly these funds went. But it's safe to assume that they didn't make their way back to the original depositors. Just when you think things can't get worse, they did. The entire world was hit by the pandemic in early 2020, and Lebanon was by no means immune to this. In fact, they were hit especially hard given that tourism accounted for 18% of their pre-pandemic economy. Meanwhile, the government, which was desperate for revenue, decided to implement a WhatsApp call tax. The idea proposed charging $6 per month to use WhatsApp for calls. As you would guess, this made people furious given that WhatsApp was their primary mode of communication. People would begin protesting outside the government HQ in Beirut, and the government would cancel the tax within hours. But this was not enough to appease the crowds. While the WhatsApp tax is what sparked the protest, there are plenty of reasons to continue the protest. Over the next few days, tens of thousands of Lebanese would protest the government's horrendous economic policies, from making the country overly dependent on foreign capital to leveraging a Ponzi scheme and engaging in blatant corruption. There was no question that much of the blame could be placed directly on the government. But despite their best efforts, these protests didn't lead to anything that substantial. I mean, even if the government wanted to, it's not like they could just pass a new legislation that would magically fix everything. This crisis had literally been brewing for 30 years, so really the only straightforward solution was to just start over from ground zero. All this economic and political turmoil was already an extremely challenging uphill battle, but things would get even worse. You see, on August 4th, 2020, Beirut would experience a deadly explosion. 200 people were killed, 5,000 people were injured, and 300,000 people were displaced. At first, there was speculation that this might have been a terrorist attack, but this was actually the result of ignorance and mismanagement. Apparently, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate had been unsafely stored at a warehouse. To make things worse, multiple government agencies had been warned about the threat of this happening, yet no action was ever taken. At this point, most Lebanese have lost all hope, and they've been fleeing the country in masses. Mass emigration is nothing new for Lebanon. However, historic emigration was never enough for the country's total population to decline until 2015. Since then, Lebanon's population has decreased from 6.4 million to 5.4 million, and the UN expects that this decline will continue for the next 10 years. With all of the most talented people leaving the country, it just becomes even less likely that the country ever recovers. As for the people left in Lebanon, the government has been trying to secure a bailout for quite some time now, but no one really wants to bail out Lebanon. Foreign capital is one of the main reasons for Lebanon's current economic crisis, so it makes little sense to hand over even more capital to the country, not to mention the widespread corruption across the government. A few months ago, Lebanon was able to secure a $3 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund or the IMF, but $3 billion is nothing when it comes to running a full country, and Lebanon is gonna need more money in no time. Despite this dire economic situation, many are still hopeful that change is possible. You see, Lebanon had a breakthrough election in May. 13 independent candidates from the opposition were able to win seats in parliament. But given that their parliament has 128 seats, this is barely 10%. So there's a ways to go in terms of creating real political reform. But many Lebanese are hopeful that this is the first step in creating said change. In the meantime, the Lebanese will have to continue putting up with the rapidly devaluing currency, hyperinflation, and loads of corruption, all with minimum foreign help. Hopefully they'll make it to the other side, but only time will tell. Do you think Lebanon can recover? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you're rooting for the Lebanese. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.